Thank you, Pastor Cam. Creation BC is a provincial ministry based in Vancouver area. We're about 60 years old, and we've been bringing in guest speakers for the creation message for all that time. Mike Oard is very familiar with us. He tells me today this is his third visit to to BC anyway, through Creation Ministries. And we're very thankful for a church like this, for Pastor Cam, who is a big supporter of Creation Message. And we go back decades, well, a couple decades with him pretty well, so we're very thankful for him. We'll do this session. We hope to have a time for a couple of questions at the end of it, and then I'll come up and tell you more about our ministry. But for now, I'll introduce Mike Oard. He's got a master's degree in atmospheric science from the University of Washington. He was a research meteorologist for 6 years, and he's written many books and co-written many books for the Creation Ministries. He's written hundreds of articles, or well over 100 articles in periodicals. He's very familiar with the flood, the ice age. He's very familiar with geology. He lives in Montana, so that's just south of Alberta, so he knows all the dinosaur fossil beds and all that. He spent a lot of time in that area, as well as going through the Grand Canyon and looking at evidence for a young Earth and a global flood. And so we're very happy to have, he's also a fellow of the Creation Research Society, so that's quite an honor for him to be that. So Mike Oard, we welcome you here.
Aha, okay. Okay, am I on? Okay. Greetings from the possible 11th province of Canada. Anyway, the title of this is, Can Genesis 1 to 11 be taken literally? Does it really matter? Now, the word literally, don't be scared by that. That means you take what you're reading in the genre that it's written in. If it's historical narrative, it's meant to be taken as straightforward history. If it's poetic like Psalms, you got to remember that. And if it's prophecy, you remember that. And we realize that there are symbols in the Bible, and that's obvious. Like it says where God has wings in the Psalms, but that's taking it literally. Now, evolution and what's called deep time, which is the millions of years, are widely taught in Western culture and even worldwide. They are major stumbling blocks to the gospel and why so many have rejected Christianity. Non-Christians have come to believe science has disproved the Bible, and Christianity is a fairy tale. Therefore, we need to learn about evolution and deep time and what the Bible has to say. The acceptance of Jesus has changed millions of lives, but eventually these Christians are confronted with the origin story of our culture. Many accept it and fit it into the Bible. This is generally called theistic evolution. Many Christians ignore the issue and do not believe the creation, the flood, and Genesis 1 to 11 are relevant for their lives. Some think the subject is divisive, but the culture picks off the children and grandchildren because Christians in general do not have answers. Pardon me? Did you all hear that?
Yes.
It was.
It's just that we have to turn it up really bright. It's booming. Yeah.
Okay, take it further away.
Towards the mouth.
Oh, toward me,
Yeah.
okay. Is that better? Okay. Thank you. Christians are also unaware of how the world's origin story has affected the church and society. 2 Timothy 3:16-17 tells us all scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. Amen to that. Yes. But what does Genesis 1 to 11 say? Well, Genesis 1 and 2 are the account of the creation. Genesis 3 is the fall of man into sin. Before that, every animal and people were vegetarians. There was no death before Adam and Eve sinned. And then Genesis 4 is the sad account of the first murder of Cain and Abel. Genesis 6 to 9 is the account of the global flood, not a local flood. In Genesis 5, 10, 11 are the genealogies that indicate that the earth is young. So that's what Genesis says. But the culture says that Genesis is untrue or non-literal because of evolution and deep time. And when people talk about evidence for evolution, they think of small changes, for instance, between all the varieties of dogs. But this is really not evolution. It is caused by the shuffling of genes that is part of the variety of every organism. This is the evolutionary tree of life. This is what we talk about when we're talking about evolution, not small changes among dogs, for instance. We're talking about molecules to man, evolution over millions of years. Evolution teaches that non-living chemicals formed the first living cell from the soupy sea, which then evolved into all types of plants and animals. This is what is meant by evolution, and it is not a fact of science, as I will show. It's important to realize that evolution not only includes the biology, it includes everything, because it's an origin story that was invented without God. It was to replace God, which means we shouldn't marry the two in the Bible, just on that basis. But they have ideas of geological evolution, about the solar system evolving from a dust cloud and the earth forming. It formed hot and it cooled, and they got a whole scenario for the evolution of the earth. But then you can go out into space, and there's a whole story of astronomical evolution. And even the elements in the periodic table evolved. Everything evolved because God is not in the picture. That's evolution. That's what our culture is trying to tell us. That's what they teach in the public schools and in some Christian schools. And I might add, in most Christian Bible schools and seminaries, believe it or not. Why? Because those professors, most of them got their education from secular universities. So we have some real problems in our church. But let's look at the history of this issue, and we can get some understanding of why we're in this situation. Well, Genesis was believed up to the late 1700s by the culture. They might not have followed the Bible very close, or didn't even know much about the Bible. But still, they believed what Genesis said until the late 1700s. Then there was Genesis and the Bible were arbitrarily rejected starting in the late 1700s. And a term called uniformitarianism was developed, and it was assumed in geology. How many know what uniformitarianism is? I don't expect too many, but it's a geological jargon for the assumption they use to explain all the rocks and fossils that we see that are records of the past. They say that we can only explain those by present processes we see today, uniform processes we see today, like river erosion and river deposition. So if you look at the Grand Canyon and they say, well, that's a result of present processes of deposition of sediments, well, of course the earth is millions of years old, because it takes millions of years old for present process to form 4,000 feet or about 1,500 meters of sedimentary rocks over that distance. But this is an arbitrary assumption, you see. It was based on no evidence, because in the late 1700s they hardly knew anything about geology. They didn't even know whether basalt lava was a lava or a sedimentary rock. And yet they made these decisions, and because of that, the earth became old instantly. Deep time, millions of years. And only 100 years later, evolution came along, 1859, because of Darwin. The idea of evolution had been around for a while, But they thought Darwin proved it, but he really didn't. And it became a fact. And nothing has changed since then. It's still the same today, taught. Concepts we're going way back to the late 1700s and into the 1800s. And they're right. Indeed, Genesis 1 to 11 does contradict this cultural origin story. For instance, in Genesis 1, in the account of the creation, the chronological account, God created after its kind, and everything was to reproduce into its kind, not reproduce into some other kind. That'd be evolution. Everything would reproduce true to its kind. Now, the kind is not the species level. In the kind, God put in all kinds of variety that were expressed with time, the varieties of dogs that came from the ark. You only need 2 dogs on the ark, and from those 2 dogs, you can have wolves that differentiate, coyotes, and other types of dogs, just from 2 dogs. It's all built in at the creation. Some people call that microevolution, but I don't believe that's any evolution at all. It's a differentiation of the genetic material already built in. And then when you look at the order in Genesis and the order in evolution, there's a lot of contradictions between the 2 orders. So it's very difficult to marry the 2, as many Christian scholars over the years have desired to do. And also, major doctrines of Christianity are developed in Genesis 1 to 11. So if we toss out Genesis 1 to 11, we have some serious problems. For instance, the doctrine of marriage starts in Genesis. For instance, in Matthew 19, 4-6, it says, and he answered and said, have you not read? Have you not read? Jesus expects us to read the Bible. Supposed to know. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning, notice that, from the beginning, made them male and female. Oh, and by the way, there's only 2 genders. That issue's closed, solved. And he said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer 2, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. And there's a bonus feature in this, in that Jesus quoted from Genesis 1, he made them male and female, and Genesis 2, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, etc. In other words, Jesus didn't think Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 were separate creation accounts, as some theistic evolutionists say, like Hugh Ross. No, he used them. Well, how do you view these? Well, Genesis 1 is the chronology of the creation. Genesis 2 is just a rehash from man's point of view. It's that simple. They're not 2 separate creation stories. The origin of marriage comes from Genesis 1 and 2. So if you throw out Genesis, what about marriage? And our culture, of course, doesn't value that marriage that much anymore. And then another issue built from Genesis is sin. How did the world get so chaotic? And it's because of sin. And from sin, death resulted. And the gospel is all about dealing with our sin. And if we throw out Genesis 1 to 11, we throw out the fall of man, and that would indicate that man never sinned, if you believe that, to be logical. And I'm glad that most Christians aren't logical on that. Which is good. They hang on, but to be consistent, it is a problem if you throw out Genesis 1 to 11, because Genesis 3 goes. And you know, the atheists recognize this. For instance, this was a quote in a debate with William Lane Craig. And this atheist, Frank Zindler, said the most devastating thing that biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. Now that we know that Adam and Eve never were real people, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was an original sin, there is no need of salvation. If there's no need of salvation, there's no need of a Savior. And I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. He understands the issues and why we need to stick to Genesis 1 to 11. And we have a lot of scientific evidence to do that. It's not a blind faith. Christianity is not a blind faith. We have tons of evidence in archaeology, science, fulfilled prophecy, and millions of changed lives. Here's another quote from Ronald Numbers, who started off as a young earth creationist, but he went to college, and he bought into the idea that the so-called fossil forests in Yellowstone Park, which I've written about and guide people to those places, took tens of thousands of years. He just simply bought into it. And finally, he fell from being a Christian into being what he calls an agnostic. And he said this, and it's quoted in World Magazine: with evolution, you don't start out with anything perfect. There's no perfect state from which to fall. This makes the whole plan of salvation silly because there never was a fall. See the issue? That's why we need Genesis 1 to 11 especially. And there's also other reasons, because Romans 5:12 tells us that just as the world through one man, and I missed a word there, death entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all people because all sinned. In other words, there was no death before Adam and Eve sinned. But if you look at the evolutionary scenario, they got millions of years of death and suffering, survival of the fittest. That's supposedly the mechanism of evolution. Over millions of years, finally at the very end, man results from some ape-like creature. That's their idea. So you had millions of years of death before Adam and Eve even arrived on the scene, according to their ideas. So that's the problem. But that's why we need to believe all of Genesis 1 to 11 as being real. Also, there's a tremendous amount of scriptural evidence for a global flood. How many have heard of the local flood? Probably all of you at some time or another. That's what they teach on practically all Bible schools and seminaries. It was a local flood. But Scripture is tremendously against that. Whoops. The context of Genesis 6 to 9 is all the high heavens under the whole heaven were covered by water. I mean, the superlatives, there's at least 30 universal terms in Genesis for the flood covering the whole earth. And the ark landed in the mountains. If you're in a local flood and you happen to be in a boat, you're going downstream, end up on a floodplain or maybe clear into the ocean. You don't end up going the other way up into the mountains, do you? No. When you end up in the mountains, it's from a global flood that's going down. The first areas of land that show up are going to be the mountains. So that's where the ark landed. So it makes sense that it's a universal flood. And then the tops of the mountains seen after 75 days, what kind of local flood is that? And especially this one, animals on the ark, 2 of each unclean kind. And remember, kind, not species. And there's plenty of room on the ark, by the way. The animals, if it was a local flood, they could just retreat maybe 40 kilometers away, and they'd just be fine, go to higher ground. But God sent, now Noah didn't have to trap them, God sent the animals, 2 of each unclean kind, to the ark. So you wouldn't need to have an ark, a huge boat that's about 80 meters long for the animals. It makes no sense. And a 371-day flood is hardly local. And the covenant of the rainbow would make absolutely no sense if it was a local flood, because there's been tens of thousands of local floods. That means God broke his promise tens of thousands of times. Yeah, right. Animals were told to repopulate the earth. Why repopulate if they're somewhere else on the earth, unless the earth was totally destroyed? Same with people. Anyway, it's obvious that the Bible, that it was a global flood. Also, the genealogies, you can simply add up all those genealogies from Genesis 5 to 11. They're very precise. And you can get back to Adam that lived about 6,000 years ago. And 6,000 years, that's where we get the young earth. And what did Jesus believe about the flood and the age of the earth? Did Jesus say anything about the age of the earth? Indeed, he did, as we'll get into. Matthew 24, 37 to 39 says, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah." Jesus believed there was a real man named Noah. "For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, till the day that Noah entered the ark." Jesus believed in a real ark, but practically everybody wasn't paying attention to the signs of the times. And they did not understand until the flood came and took a few of them away in a local flood, took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. But the word all can refer to a region, not necessarily the globe. But in this case, Jesus is comparing his second coming, which Revelations 1:7 says will be a global coming back. It says all eyes will see him. It's going to be a global coming back. He's not going to compare a global coming back to a local event, is he? But a global event. Jesus believed in a global flood. And if Jesus believed it, I'm certainly going to believe it. And there's a number of verses that indicate that Jesus believed in a young earth, like Mark 13:19. "For those days will be a time of tribulation," this is the second coming, "such as not occurred since the beginning of the creation which God created until now and never will be." In other words, for a tribulation to occur with humans, there has to be humans at the beginning of creation. So there's no gap there between Genesis 1:1 and 1 and 2, which I'll get into also. And in Mark 10:16, another verse about marriage. "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." The beginning of creation. And even here, "so that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah." In other words, Abel's blood was shed since near the foundation of the world, at the creation. So Genesis can be taken literally. The Bible has withstood the test of time. And Genesis 1 to 11 are written as historical narrative, which means it should be read as historical narrative. Straightforward history. And Jesus quoted from Genesis 1 to 11 numerous times. I gave you one quote already about the flood. And Genesis 1 to 11 blends naturally into Genesis 12 to 50 about the origin of the Jewish nation. And this is supported by abundant archaeology. So there's no cut off there where Genesis 1 to 11 should be a myth and Genesis 12 to 50 is history. No, it just blends naturally. And Genesis does not contradict the observations of science. No observation of science contradicts Genesis or the Bible. It's the interpretations that they apply for the observations that do. And creation is supported by science. For instance, the extreme complexity of all biology shows that there had to be a creator. In fact, that's one of the main reasons that attracted me to becoming a Christian. I realized when I was 18 years old that this world is just too complicated to come about by itself without God. That got me started. And also the mechanism of evolution, which is random mutations and natural selection, when you dig into it, does not work. It's a pathetic mechanism. And macroevolution is not occurring today. We're not seeing any big changes. And evolution is not seen in the fossil record, which is a record of the past, because of the universal gaps between kinds of organisms in the fossil record and in the biology today. And the idea that chemicals in a soupy sea got together to form the first cell is impossible. Easy to show. which I've done before. And to back up one of these claims, I'm quoting from David Kitts in the journal Evolution. Yeah, there's a journal called Evolution. And he says, evolution, at least in the sense that Darwin speaks of it, cannot be detected within the lifetime of a single observer. Well, if it can't be detected, it's not science, and it's not repeatable. See, science has to, you observe it, and you need to repeat it, be able to repeat it. Anyway, there's several ways to think of science, and this is one. You know, when we have airplanes and computers, cell phones, that's a result of operational science. But what we're talking about is historical science, which I think is an oxymoron, but we'll just use this term. In other words, we got to go for clues in the present to determine the past. And that's historical science. But it depends on your worldview, where you start. And so if your worldview is you believe in millions of years in evolution, that's what you're going to see in the rocks and the fossils. But if you believe in the flood and creation, you will see that. It depends on where your mind is. Another way to think of it is that science is in the present, evolution is in the past. Science is repeatable, evolution's one time, they claim. Science is observable, evolution's not seen going on today. We don't have to believe all this stuff that the culture tries to tell us we need to believe. They even tell us these things are facts, and they're not. But unfortunately, scholars of the past, starting in the early 1800s, tried to marry the millions of years into the Bible. And then when evolution came around after 1859, they tried to marry evolution into the Bible. Why did they do this? For a lot of reasons. A lot of it was just naivety and lack of discernment, because a lot of them simply believe the scientists being correct. They're objective people, so they must be right. No, they made some big mistakes in the past, and they're making mistakes today. So some of the ideas trying to fit millions of years in evolution into the Bible, the gap theory, the day-age theory. I'm going to mention those two especially. Those are the two biggies that the people believe in. There's other ones, progressive creation, the idea that God created in small steps and it got stuck, and so he created again in another step, and so forth, many steps. And it's all according to the evolutionary scenario from molecules to man. That's believed by Hugh Ross, who was a man that is opposed to young earth creationists. Theistic evolution is just a general term that God used evolution to create. And if evolution is not correct, and it's easy to show that it's not, why do we need to marry it to the Bible? I've always seen for a long time that that's unnecessary. Totally unnecessary. The Bible could stand on its own. So let's talk about the word day in Genesis 1. It's the Hebrew word yom. And the word day, you have to look at the context. What is the context? And day can be used three different times. In my father's day, he drove across the United States in 6 days during the day. It's used three times there. And the context tells you which it is. And so let's look at the context in Genesis. Outside Genesis to see how it would be used in Genesis 1. A day with a number, 410 times. In the rest of the Hebrew scripture, other than Genesis 1, it always means an ordinary day. Evening and a morning together without day, or 38 times, always means an ordinary day. Evening or morning together with day, 23 times, outside Genesis 1, always means a literal day. Night with day, 52 times, always means an ordinary day. And in Genesis 1, we see evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day. And the uses of these outside Genesis 1 are always mean a literal day. Therefore, I would say we have a solid case that the word yom, Hebrew word yom, in Genesis 1 is talking about a 24-hour day. God created in 6 literal days. Now, if it was long ages, there is a word for that. There's a Hebrew word for long ages. And by the way, day can also be used a small number of times in the Hebrew scripture to mean the day of the Lord, a vague period of time. Like in my father's day when he drove but that's a very small number. Otherwise, I think it's well over 1,500 times. Day always means a literal day, except for that day of the Lord, or the day of Abraham. So it's pretty clear to me that it's 24-hour days, literal days. And this was a popular hypothesis, especially years ago from evangelical Christians. There was a gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. And in that gap, millions and billions of years were placed, geological ages, and it was claimed that it was because of Lucifer's flood that God destroyed the earth and then recreated it starting in Genesis 1-2. How many have heard of the gap theory? Okay, yeah, it's widely known. And they retranslate some of the words in Genesis 1-2 to make it sound like there's a gap there. Genesis 1:2 says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the earth. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the earth," and so forth. And then everything was created in 6 days. They changed the word "and" to "but," and the word "was" to "became." But the earth became without form and void. But that is poor exegesis. Poor exegesis. And there's also 2 Peter 3:8. When it comes to these things that, but beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. In other words, it means this does not have anything to do with a gap or the days. It just means that God's outside time. That's all that means. And in the Bible, in the 10 Commandments, you read this, Exodus 20:11, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them." That includes Genesis 1:1 and the rest of Genesis 1. In 6 days, he made it all. There's no gap. And rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And science, like I was saying, does go along with Genesis. And creation scientists have been at it for, about 70 years. Evolution in deep time, meaning the millions of years is deep time, almost took over the whole church. Then John Whitcomb and Henry Morris published the Genesis Flood, the book Genesis. How many have read the Genesis Flood? Just a few of you. Anyway, that got the modern creation science movement going starting in 1961, and it's gained momentum ever since that day. And we've discovered we don't have to believe this cultural origin story that they feed to us. We can stick to the Bible. And we don't have to leave our brains outside the church, as they claim that we have to do. So we've learned a few things in this process. We first of all find that bones don't come with dates on them. The bone is a science, and the rock it's found in is the science. But the date is an interpretation based on their worldview and their dating methods. Carbon-14 dating dates organic matter, and it has a short half-life of 5,730 years. So after 80,000 years, if anything with carbon in it is older than 80,000 years, you can't detect any more carbon-14. I'll get to that. I'm getting right to that. But first of all, I need to tell you there are some rocks with dates on them, and these are them right here. Okay, well... But their dating methods, they get a lot of wrong dates. And there's a lot of assumptions going into dating methods. And they use these as sometimes the violation of these assumptions to get rid of dates they don't want. There's a lot of issues in this that you'd be unaware of. Anyway, they get a lot of wrong dates. For instance, here in the Grand Canyon, my cursor, you can, no, that's right, it doesn't work with presenter's mode. Anyway, at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, those black features there are types of basalt. And they're dated by what's called the rubidium-strontium isochrone method to 1.07 billion years. But then on the top of the Grand Canyon, on the northwest rim, you have these sharp cones, and lava is come from, they're recent because they're very sharp, and the lava hasn't been eroded, and it's actually flowed down the walls of the Grand Canyon. And they've dated that. And by the same method, they date that fairly modern lava flow to 1.34 billion years by the same method. So something's wrong somewhere. Anyway, there was the RATE project was done by 8 creation PhD scientists to determine why do these dating methods still give millions and billions of years. We know there's lots of problems with it. And so they discovered several things. They decided, well, coal, we're going to date coal by carbon-14. Now, coal is dated anywhere from 15 million to 350 million years by their dating systems. And we dated it by carbon-14, and we found carbon-14 in every coal sample. And they do too. So that would mean, with carbon-14 being less than 80,000 years, if you find carbon-14 in anything, it means the coal is less than 80,000 years. It doesn't mean it's 80,000, it means less than 80,000. Coal is young, but they say it's contaminated. In other words, a crack was through the coal and young carbon came down there. And so when they took their sample, they got the young carbon. How likely is that? Especially that we've done this over 100 times. Dated coal and got carbon-14. And when you go out to sample coal, you're not going to sample a crack. So we humored them. We decided we're going to date something that can't be contaminated. Diamonds. And we were the first ones to do this. No one had ever done this by carbon-14. And guess what? We found carbon-14 in every diamond, meaning the diamonds are less than 80,000 years old, but they claim they're 1.2 billion years old. This indicates there's a tremendous amount of problems with the dating methods. That's the actual age we got from carbon-14, 58,000 years. And they're from the flood. Anyway, why did they still give millions and billions of years? Dr. Russell Humphreys decided to date zircon crystals in biotite. See, granite's made up of 4 main minerals. 2 of them are black. One of the black minerals is biotite. Biotite is black mica. And in the black mica, you have these tiny zircon crystals. You need a microscope to see them. And these zircon crystals are highly radioactive with uranium. And uranium decays to lead over 18 steps, 18 elements. Uranium goes to lead. And in the process, and by the way, he calculated an age of 1.5 billion years of change by that method. But in the process, it gave off 8 helium nuclei that grabbed electrons from the surrounding and became helium atom. Now, helium's a gas. It's a noble gas. Nothing reacts with it. And so it'll tend to leak out with time. And you can date it. These crystals were chock full of helium, meaning they were young. And based on that, he got an age of about, a little less than 6,000 years for the age of that crystal. Yet, the uranium-lead method gave 1.5 billion years. How do we reconcile that? Well, the leakage of helium is a well-known physical principle called diffusion. But we still don't understand why uranium changes to lead. So we believe that the crystals 6,000 years, and then within 6,000 years, we had 1.5 billion years of radiometric decay. We call it accelerated radiometric decay, and that's why we have millions and billions of years. We don't know when. Some people think it happened at creation, because during creation, it was a super miracle. God created things with an appearance of age. That's when he could have caused these accelerated radiometric decay from these unstable elements. Or some people think during the flood, which is a gigantic catastrophe, or both. They really don't know. So we're able to explain those old ages. And I myself have a personal reason for being skeptical of millions of years. I was a weather forecaster for 30 years, and I ruined thousands of outdoor activities by predicting today's forecast, 100% chance of sunshine, or maybe 80% chance or something like that, and it rains on them. So when I first got into the National Weather Service, we could barely forecast the weather the next day. The models that we used were not very good. They're a lot better now. You can count on them generally till 5 days. Anyway, tell me again why I should trust scientists' ability to be accurate about life on Earth millions of years ago. That made me kind of skeptical. It was a good training ground to be a creation scientist. So ultimately, what's the basic issue here? Which authority are we going to rely on? The infallible Word of God? Or man's fallible opinions, sinful man's fallible opinions about the past. So I know where I'm going to believe, and I find that this is intellectually defensible. But does it matter? Does it matter what you believe? Yeah, because ideas have consequences. If you have Adam in your belief, God sets the rules. But if you have ape, we evolved from the ape, man sets the rules. And when man sets the rules, all kinds of bad things have happened in the culture as a result. It's called social Darwinism. And here's just a summary of them. Atheism, secular humanism became popular. Eugenics is an evolutionary concept. If anyone knows anything about that. Relativism is a result of evolution. The idea that life is useless, we're just like evolved from pond scum or stardust. There's all kinds of symbols that they give young people. Charity is harmful, unethical business practices. But there's a whole list of those, and I'm going to just leave you at that. But it's also affected the church, because the church did not have discernment in the 1800s to check into this deeper. I believe it's a main cause of liberalism within the mainland churches and universities. Evolution in deep time strongly are advocated with evangelical and conservative church denominations. It's seeped into all these. It's a sad case out there. If you want to go to a Christian college that won't teach you evolution in deep time, look on the Answers in Genesis website, and you'll see a list of colleges that won't. Cedarville University is one that won't. Masters University in California won't. But there's a list of them. But most of them will. And answers not widely taught are not widely taught in the churches. So Christians are vulnerable to the anti-Christian culture. These are some major problems, and this is one reason why we're using the youth, as I'll get into. Now, liberalism started with, in the 1800s, by the Wellhausen School. How many have heard of Julius Wellhausen? Just a few. He is considered one of 7 men who ruled the world from the grave. There's a book on that title. It's very insightful. Who was this guy? He was a scholar in Germany who said that, well, to interpret the first 5 books of Genesis, they're made up of a combination of 4 traditions, the JEPD, called the documentary hypothesis also. Has anyone ever heard of this stuff? Okay, not many of you, so I won't go into it anymore. But he assumed that religion was a product of evolution. Yeah, they got a whole scenario of the evolution of religion, by the way. He believed that, and it's untouched by the supernatural. Anyway, we're losing the youth. Polls indicate that when young people leave church, 2/3 of them stop going to church and stop believing in the Bible. This is from Barna, I believe. Only 1 in 3 continue with the faith. Why are we losing the youth? Well, there's several reasons, but Answers in Genesis decided to ask why. Based on a poll of 1,000 evangelicals in their 20s who left church, they asked them, why did you leave? About half did not believe the entire Bible. Most believe the earth is old. Old dates caused about half to doubt the Bible. So that was the issue. Old ages, the millions of years, got to them, and they realized that Genesis teaches a younger, so they ended up not believing the Bible and leaving church, thinking it's a fairy tale. But things are changing. Things are changing. We're getting educated. People are getting educated. We're waking up to the devastation, not only in the church, but the culture, from the evolution of millions of years. Answers to questions from the culture are being provided. And by the way, that's what the Lord has led me to do over 50 years of creation research. He's led me to answer the challenges that they give, which I've been able to do. And that's why I write a lot about these things. And we have answers to their challenges. And in their sciences, there's several hundred. The reason I know that is because I keep up with about 50 earth science journals at the Montana State University Library. So I read 95% of the material I read is evolutionary. So I know our challenges. And I've worked on them, and others have worked on them. So we have answers to many of these challenges that you hear. And there are many new creation scientists, creation ministries, and speakers. And more resources are out there to equip the church, are being added every year. There are well over 1,000 books and DVDs you can get. When I first got involved in this, there were maybe about 5. So there's a wealth of information to educate yourself, to prepare, to have answers for yourself, for your children and grandchildren. So in summary, Genesis and the Bible has withstood the test of time from an army of critics. Archaeology has verified the Bible numerous times, even against what skeptics believed. Genesis 1 to 11 is literal and can be defended. Jesus believed in it. Secular ideas have greatly impacted the church and society, and they affect our families, and we need to get answers and get equipped. And one of the best books, if you don't know much about this issue and you have many questions, there's a number of answers books. There are answers for children and adults. Answers in Genesis has a 4-volume pack of answers. These are questions that people commonly have with answers. And here's one from Creation Ministries International. That's just 1 volume. It's not here, but there's other answers books on the table. Anyway, that's a resource that you can get. And if you're really not sure that whether evolution's true or not, there's a great resource out there. You have to get it online because they don't have any at the table there. But this is the best resource you can have. It's called Evolution's Achilles Heels by 15 PhD scientists. Gives 8 fatal evidences against evolution. It's a DV form and book form. And then if you wonder about deep time, I had a pastor come up to me and said, all the resources we have to understand this issue of millions of years are too complicated. So that got me to say, I'm going to write a resource for the layman with no science background. And this is why I wrote this book, The Deep Time Deception, Examining the Case for Millions of Years. Unfortunately, it's not at the book table. I'm only telling you about it because I think it's an important resource if the millions of years are bothering you. You can get it online. Anyway, I want to leave you with this verse, and I'm going to give you some websites where you can get free information. Now, if you're wondering about the world and their ideas, read 1 Corinthians chapters 1, 2, and 3. It has a lot to say about the so-called wisdom of man. Your faith should not rest on the wisdom of men. And that's what evolution in deep time is. It's the wisdom of men trying to explain everything without God. But our faith should rest on the power of God. God has the power to create, cause a flood, and to change lives. As history shows, millions of lives have been changed over the years. And those websites, right, here's some. Mine I'm going to talk a little bit about. I have 2 free ebooks on there. They're so huge that no one would publish them, so I made it free. There's one about the runoff of the floodwaters as the continents were becoming exposed, running off. It eroded 1,900 meters of sediment on the average, and it marked the surface of the landscape that we can see as we drive around, and it shows features from the runoff that they can't explain by theirs. That's what I got a whole free ebook on that. But I want to especially emphasize creation.com and answersingenesis.org, because on those websites, there's over 10,000 articles for all ages, all scientific abilities. You have to do a search engine on them. Like if you say someone asks you, your neighbor asks you a question like, where did Cain get his wife? You should be able to answer that. It's got an easy answer if you've heard it before. But you can go to creation.com and look up Cain's wife, and you can get an answer real quick, and you can go back. A great resource for term papers in college. So that's all I have, and there might be time for a question or two.